Hi, welcome back. Now I know this channel is about growing and the joy of growing, but today I'm going to stretch the point a little bit because I've had quite a lot of interest from friends since we started on lockdown who've asked me to show them how to make a sourdough culture so that they can do more home baking at home. They're concerned about the lack of yeast in the shops and they have the time available on their hands to be able to learn a new skill. So today we're going to learn how to make the sourdough culture. Right at the beginning I want to say that it's important to understand that sourdough bread is not yeast-free. So if you have a yeast allergy or a yeast intolerance, this is not the answer for you. Having said that, quite a lot of people who find that industrially produced bread really makes them bloated and uncomfortable, sourdough can be the answer because it has far less yeast involved in its production. What a sourdough is a bread that is made with the wild yeasts that are in the atmosphere, that are developed in a culture of flour and water, kept warm and nurtured into a liquid culture. It's a very long, slow process, as is all good bread making. It should take a minimum of 4 hours. Sourdough will take you a couple of days, but most of that time you're not actually doing anything. So it's something that you can do part of the process, move on and do something else. So it's actually quite a nice part of slowing down your life and taking your time, which is important in recovery from fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue and ME. So to get started, all you need for your sourdough culture is 40 grams of your chosen flour and 40 grams of water. You can use any flour you like. This is wheat bread flour. You could use rye or spelt. The only thing I would say is that you need to use the flour that you're going to bake with in the final product, because the culture that you're going to develop will be adapted specifically to what is in this type of flour. So to make the starter, all you need is about 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. Now the flour I have here is wheat, it's strong bread flour. You could use rye or spelt, any flour that you choose, but I would say that you need to make a starter with the flour that you're going to use to make the bread at the end. So if you're going to make rye bread, use rye flour. You might want to do a couple once you've started. As for the water, this is water that has been boiled in the kettle and then cooled. That helps to get rid of some of the chlorine which is in our water, which isn't very good for the culture developing. If you remember that chlorine is actually used as a cleaning agent in swimming pools. So cool boiled water, flour, pour one into the other and give it a stir. Will give you a mixture that's nice and soft, dropping consistency. I'm going to use my fingers as a spatula, they are clean, just to get the last of that mixture off the spoon and into the jar. Like that. Just clean down the edges a little bit. There are already yeasts in this flour, they're on the grain, they're on everything around us all the time. So all we're doing here is creating an atmosphere that they will like, of warmth and water. So I'm going to put a cover on this now to stop the dust getting in. And I'm simply going to put that in a warm place. I have a dehydrator that I use for this, but if you haven't got something like that, you could use a plant propagator, would be about the right temperature. You could put it in an airing cupboard. If you haven't got anything else, use a hot water bottle, but don't put it actually against, never put a hot heat source next to the container because it will overheat and kill the yeasts. But once you've got it warm, you can wrap it up and insulate it to keep it nice and warm, maybe over a radiator. And I will come back and have a look at this tomorrow. For those of you who might be interested, this is where I've got my sourdough starter. It's a dehydrator. And I use it for dehydrating all sorts of things, particularly sliced apples from our trees, but also tomatoes, all sorts of things. It usually has trays in it. You can see the little rims at the side that they sit in, and at the back it has a fan, and it just keeps the right temperature all the time. It costs very little to run. And at the top there you can see that there is a dial, so you can use it for all sorts of different things. You can get cheaper ones, but I would avoid anything with plastic because it tends to denature and they don't last very long. So having got my sourdough in here, one on the left is my existing sourdough which I'm boosting to do another loaf. I just need to put the door on the front like that and leave it. It's day 2 now, and my starter, sitting here in this jar, equal parts of flour and water, has been sitting in my dehydrator at a constant temperature of just below 35 degrees for the last 24 hours. And you might notice that already it's filling up considerably more of the jar than it was, and it has a sort of a consistency almost of jelly. I'll hold it up close and you can see that there are quite a lot of bubbles already. That's just within 24 hours. The bubbles are carbon dioxide that are produced by the living organisms in here, and at the bottom you can just see that there's a clear patch. Now that is called hooch, and it's a mixture of alcohol and water, and again that's a byproduct of these living organisms, the yeast and the positive bacteria that work alongside them as well. It's never just one organism. You might find, if yours has gone further than mine, that it's risen up in the container and then dropped back down again, in which case you should see a tide mark. And you might well also have a layer of that hooch sitting on the top. That's fine. All you need to do is stir it in. There is nothing wrong with that. And then give it a sniff. Very different from flour as well. It's a little bit acidic and coming along very nicely. Obviously, you've seen how much that's risen in the jar already. It can't keep in that jar or it would overflow. So what I'm going to do is take 40 grams of water, exactly the same as yesterday, that's been boiled and then cooled. And I'm going to add my starter into that container. And you should really see the aeration that's happened in there. It's floating on the top of the water with all of those bubbles. Now it's floating on the water, you might be able to see even better the bubbles in there. And then to the water and that starter culture, 40 grams of flour. Stir it thoroughly. Doesn't matter if it's a bit lumpy because the culture will work on those lumps anyway. And I'm going to scrape around the edges just so that I can see the extent to which it's risen up and then dropped again within my container. So there you go, that's all you do on day 2. I'm going to cover that over, put it back in the dehydrator, and then I'll have a look at it again tomorrow. It's day 3 and the sourdough starter has changed again. I uncover it. There is a lot more bubbling going on. I've kept the cover on to stop it forming a crust on the top. If it does, don't worry about it. Just maybe put a little bit of water over the top to help dissolve it. It will all get incorporated in the end, but it's better if you can keep it nice and moist. If I hold this up to the camera, you can see that layer of hooch, the dark layer that you can see there, there's more of it. That's the alcohol and water produced by the culture itself. Also, you can see that there's a lot more bubbles, and actually they've risen up part way up the jar and then collapsed back down again. So this has reached its peak sometime in the night. So all I'm going to do today is exactly the same as other days. That's 40 grams of flour, 40 grams of boiled cooled water. And stir it in. It's making a nice little crackly noise there as I pop the bubbles. Mix it all in nicely. There's no bits of dry flour. It doesn't need to be completely smooth. The culture will still reach all that flour and it will end up all incorporated anyway. And just for the interest of the camera so we can see it rising, I'm going to scrape around the edges so we can see the point at which we start today and we come back to it again tomorrow. I've used 40 grams of flour, But the most important thing is that it's equal parts of flour and water. So if you wanted to make a smaller amount, you could start with, say, 25 grams, which is the equivalent of an ounce. And there we go. Day 3, bubbling already. I'll put the cover on and put it back in its nice warm place until tomorrow. So now it's day 4. And you'll be able to see, even from this distance, that the culture, because that's what it now is looking very different from the original white paste that we had, flour and water, on day 1. There's a much thicker layer of hooch on the top, and if you remember, that's a mixture of alcohol and water. And the alcohol is what's been produced as a byproduct of the living organisms, the yeast and the bacteria within this culture. Above that, you can see a tide mark on the side of the jar, which shows that this has bubbled up sometime in the night and then collapsed back down on itself. So actually, at the moment, it's on a sort of waning phase. Once I feed it, the bubbles will come back again. So all I'm going to do today is the same I've done on every other day. Equal parts of flour and water, 40 grams in this case. Dip it in. Give it a stir. It's much more liquid than it was at the beginning, and that is also a sign of the activity of the culture. So those microorganisms are working on the starch, the other substances within the flour, breaking them down, and so it's become a much more gloopy, almost oily consistency. I've got that all mixed up. There are already bubbles beginning to come to the surface, and it's more like a thick whipped cream before it gets to the stiff peak stage. So again, I'm going to scrape the sides so that I can see whether it's risen up or not. And I'll put the top back on again and pop it back in my dehydrator. So just a word on this sort of rising and falling, where the yeast culture is in its cycle. That's just been fed so that there's plenty of starch for the culture to work on, and it will begin to rise again. Once the bubbles have risen and it's really active, this will be ready for you to use for your chosen recipe. If you're not going to use it straight away, you can store a sourdough culture very easily. There's an awful lot online which suggests that it's incredibly complicated. You'll even come across references to sourdough hotels where people will keep your sourdough going while you're on holiday. You really don't need that. All you need to do is to put some or all of your starter into an airtight container and stick it in the back of your fridge, and it will last for months. These are yeast cultures, and what yeast does under difficult circumstances is it forms spores so that it will survive until it has access to the food and the situation that it needs to grow again. So in your fridge, it will just settle down into spores, and it will need reactivating. When you come to reactivate it, you need to do it a day or so before you're actually going to bake, and you just need to feed it, as we've done each day so far during this video. And once it's come back to the very active bubbling state that you will be familiar with by then, it's ready to go again. That's all there is to it. Very, very simple. The other thing to say about sourdough cultures is what you have in your container is absolutely unique to your home, which is rather a wonderful idea. So again, online you'll see that you can buy sachets of sourdough culture. Often San Francisco is the very, very popular one. And they are quite expensive, particularly when you think what it must cost you to make this out of flour and water. If you buy a commercial sourdough culture like that and you use it, you will get the flavour from that individual culture the first time. But within a couple of weeks, a shorter time as that, that culture will have been taken over by the very specific organisms that are in your household, and you will be back to exactly the same position that you are here. So this is your culture. Very special to your house, so your bread will taste different to if you'd made it somewhere else. And it's come from the yeasts and the bacteria that are naturally in the flour that you've bought, so it depends on the type of flour that you have, whether that's a wheat or a rye, or even according to the batch of wheat where it's come from. But it's also from the organisms that are on your hands and on your equipment. So even when you wash things with hot soapy water, everything is supposed to have bacteria on it. People struggle with this because we live in a world in which killing all bacteria is seen as the thing to do. But they are part of life, and they are part of the food making process, which is one of the things that I think is so very special about making a sourdough. So as I said, I'm now going to put that back in my dehydrator. It might not take 24 hours, so I'll keep an eye on it to see when it reaches its peak, when it's really bubbling actively, and that's when it will be ready to use in my recipes. And speaking of recipes, there is so much out there on sourdoughs. Remember what I said at the beginning, that a sourdough is a bread that has no commercial yeast culture in it. So if your recipe calls for dried yeast and then just a small amount of sourdough, it's not a sourdough. To find out more about sourdoughs and bread in general, this is where I started. It's a fantastic book by Andrew Whitley called Bread Matters. It has the instructions for making your starters, but also what to do with them, whether that's a rye or a spelt, all sorts of wonderful recipes, but a lot about the science process as well, which I found very interesting. And the other book, which I wouldn't be without now, is this one by Emmanuel, Hadjiandreou. I'll put the links below the video, and he has just such a wonderful variety of different recipes and things that you can do with your sourdough, from a simple pain au levain, a white sourdough loaf like this one on the front, through to using it to make croissants or bagels or pretzels, parsnip sourdough, apple sourdough, you name it. But as I say, there are many other books out there, so just take your starter and have some fun with it.